Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 30A, Marius. Last week, we ended with the death of Gaius Gracchus, the popular reformer who was driven to suicide in 121 BC. This week, we will take up the career of a man who coincidentally served as tribune of the plebs the very next year. He would not make his name in that office or that year, but 20 years later, he would be known to history as the great remaker of the Roman legions and the man who was consul 5 times in a row. What the Gracchi had started by flouting the laws against consecutive terms, Marius took to a higher office for an even longer stay. Gaius Marius was born in 157 BC in southern Latium. His hometown had been conquered by the Romans in the 4th century BC, and since that time, they had been citizens of Rome without voting rights. It wasn't until about 30 years before Marius' birth that his people were granted status as full Roman citizens. The story goes that Marius was the son of a simple farmer, but this myth of humble origins was an invention after the fact to help the poor of Rome identify with Marius, the great general and politician. His father was certainly involved in farming, but he was likely a major landowner who had numerous familial and commercial ties to the nobility in Rome. There is no other way to explain how Marius was able to get his foot in the door to high Roman office. The other great myth of Marius' early years was that as a teenager, he came across an eagle's nest with 7 chicks inside. Eagles were seen by the Romans as sacred animals looked after by Jupiter himself. Though again, this myth did not begin making the rounds until years later, especially after Marius began running for his 7th consulship, and it was impressed upon the people that it had all been preordained by Jupiter himself. Elect Marius, he once saw 7 baby eagles, and he's only been consul 6 times. Get it? You don't want to go messing around with the universe, do you? When Marius came of age, he volunteered for service in the army and was placed as an officer. Though this placement hints that his family was well connected, he was never truly accepted by his noble peers. To them, he would always be novus homo, or a new man, meaning that none of his ancestors had ever served as consul. Despite all the power, wealth, and fame he acquired over his career, to the old guard he would always be a new man, much the way that in England, no matter what Margaret Thatcher did, said, or achieved, she will always be just a grocer's daughter to the aristocratic class. Some ceilings simply cannot be broken through. Though this very status as a new man would solidify Marius' near sainthood in the eyes of other ambitious young men who could not trace their family trees back to Romulus. As a young man, Marius was stationed with Scipio Aemilianus in, wait for it, Numantia, just like our old friends the Gracchi brothers. In 134 BC, he ran for and was elected one of 24 military tribunes for the Spanish legions. He was an unknown candidate, but had a stellar service record to present. Unable to trade on his name, Marius traded on his skills and accomplishments. What a concept. This began Marius' slow and sometimes agonizing climb up the Roman political ladder. At each rung he was resisted by the old guard, who were never quick to embrace new men. So unlike many other great figures in Roman history, his elections were never a foregone conclusion. In 120 BC, though, the year after Gaius Gracchus' turbulent final term in office, Marius was elected a tribune of the plebs. He was able to do this by securing the blessing of a noble named Quintus Metellus. Though only 3 years older than Marius, the Marii family had long been clients to the Metelli family, and the old client-patron dynamic played out. Once in office, though, Marius infuriated his patrons by helping pass an election reform law the Metelli opposed. The bill, and I am not making this up, required a narrowing of the passageways electors walked down on their way to the ballot box to prevent harassment by partisans for one side or the other. The lofty ideals of democracy are often reliant on such micromanagement. The price of freedom, it seems, is eternal vigilance over the width of hallways. His relationship with Metellus strained, Marius' career stalled. Though after a few years, he stepped up another rung and managed to get elected praetor, despite charges of ballot fraud. I guess it doesn't matter how narrow a passageway is if the man walking down it is going to cast 50 votes. Marius served in Spain with some distinction for a few years, and then returned to Rome, where he married the aunt of yet-born Julius Caesar. I have to apologize for conflating Marius with Cinna at the end of last week's episode. Marius was Caesar's uncle-in-law, not father-in-law. The marriage was a boon to Marius' career and earned him a whole host of new allies amongst the elite, and around 110 BC, he even patched things up with his old patron Metellus. At this point, I would like to shift gears before we move into the next stage of Marius' life and give a little background on where he and Metellus are headed. In 119 BC, the son of Massinissa, the old Numidian ally of Rome from the Punic Wars, passed away. He left the kingdom to his two sons and a third adopted son named Jugurtha, who was technically the dead king's nephew. All three were grandsons of the great Massinissa. Jugurtha did not like to play nice with the other children, though, and immediately set about running the other two out of town. He assassinated one, but the other escaped and fled to Rome. Concerned at the power struggle in their client state and the economic disruptions caused, the Romans sent a delegation to find out what the trouble was all about. When he was a young man, Jugurtha served in Spain as a cavalryman alongside the Romans and had noticed the most glaring weakness of the legions, the ease with which its commanders could be bribed. Military commanders at this time, no longer fighting for survival, were clearly in it for the money and prestige, and saw no important distinction between plundering by force and accepting bribes not to plunder. In fact, the latter seemed far more cost-effective. Of course, to the Romans the idea of bribery was officially morally reprehensible, but this fact had little impact on commanders in the field. So when the Roman commission came to adjudicate the budding civil war in Numidia, Jugurtha bribed them handsomely to decide the issue in his favor, which they promptly did, being men of honor. Left alone and in control of half the kingdom, Jugurtha set about attacking his cousin brother to win the other half. In this struggle, the Italian merchants and citizens came down almost universally against Jugurtha, who was causing a lot of trouble and disrupting trade. In retaliation, Jugurtha took the provocative step of executing a number of Italians in his custody. The Senate could not stand by and let this go, so they sent an army to deal with the upstart. But the Roman armies were able to do little against Jugurtha. Suspiciously little. At once, an investigation was undertaken into accusations of bribery, and Jugurtha, still technically a client of Rome, was summoned to account for himself. But a few well-placed bribes later, Jugurtha was on his way back to Numidia, free as a bird, and no finding of fault being handed down on anyone. You gotta hand it to him. There is something poetic about bribing your way out of charges of bribery. But the Roman people were still up in arms about the barbarian king, and in 109 BC, the consul for the year, Marius' old patron Metellus, was sent to Numidia to put down what had become a full-fledged rebellion. He took along Marius to serve as chief lieutenant. The campaign was frustrating for both sides. Metellus was too honest to be bribed, and realizing this, Jugurtha kept to the mountains and away from the invading legions. The Numidians took a page from old Fabius the Delaire and embarked on a war of attrition with the Romans. Metellus was never able to pin the African prince down, and his troops and the public back home began to lose patience. Accusations of bribery were hurled at Metellus, and though innocent, his own perceived failure became damning evidence. Marius watched with frustration equaling that of the Roman people. He thought Metellus far too cautious and began to get the idea that he could do a better job. To curry favor with the troops, he relaxed discipline in camp and began letting it be known that if he were in charge, this war would be over in a week. Troops and traders both began to write home praising Marius to the sky, and a groundswell of support began to coalesce around the confident lieutenant. Marius asked permission to return home and stand for the consulship. Metellus disapproved of the idea, but knew the troops were getting restless, and it wouldn't do anyone any good to have Marius sulking around camp stirring up trouble, so the consul let him go. Marius came back to Rome and campaigned on a platform denouncing the slow pace of Metellus' strategy. He spoke confidently of his plan for victory, which involved aggressive scorched earth tactics. The public, wary of corrupt officials prolonging the war, swept Marius into his first consulship in 107 BC. The Senate was not exactly pleased at the do-gooder Novus Homo, who was about to spoil all their fun, and while accepting his election, attempted to deny his appointment to command of the Numidian legions. The People's Assembly, however, countered the move by invoking a little-known clause that gave them final say over a consul's placement in the field. Marius was given Numidia and tasked simply with following through on his promise to end the war. To accomplish this goal, Marius asked permission to raise his own legions. This permission was granted, but then Marius asked for an exemption from the rules governing recruitment. The number of men who qualified under the old census rules had dwindled to a bare few, even after the property qualifications had been lowered and lowered again until they practically did not exist. The army Marius raised for the Numidian campaign, while the logical conclusion of years of rewriting the rules, nonetheless marked a clear break with the past. There would be no property qualifications this time. Any citizen was eligible, landowner or not. The floodgates were open, and the poor citizens of Rome flocked to join Marius's new army. Though the move was supposed to be a temporary measure that affected only this specific levy, there was no turning back. Henceforth, the ranks of the legions would be filled by the poorest of the poor, not the richest of the rich. The elites had grown tired of the burden of military service anyway. They had plush estates and Greek philosophy to read. Let the rabble risk their lives in the provinces. It might clear off some of the excess population, and besides, it gave the poor something to do besides railing against their injustice of their lot in life, which was becoming such a bore. Let the beggars be soldiers. Whatever. It was a fateful moment that greatly accelerated the path to military dictatorship and imperium. From here on out, poor citizens became career soldiers, promised a salary while they served, and a plot of land when they retired. To most it seemed too good to be true, and in many cases it was, as the state reneged on land grants and was often slow with paychecks. Soon enough, the interests of the soldiers no longer aligned with the interests of the state, and generals who could deliver land and pay gained the loyalty of the men who now looked at the Senate as a bunch of crooked old liars. And we all know where that road will take us. But the immediate issue was the war in Numidia. Marius took his newly minted soldiers to Africa and promptly delivered on his promise, though it wasn't scorched earth brute force that carried the day, but rather a little backroom treachery of his own. After finding it was not as easy to bottle up Jugurtha as he thought, Marius dispatched one of his lieutenants to a neighboring kingdom to convince the local king, the father-in-law of Jugurtha, to betray the rebellious prince. Through a mixture of bribery and cajoling, the young lieutenant was able to pull it off, and the king delivered Jugurtha to the Roman delegation in chains. Their general captured, the Numidian army surrendered. Because he held imperium over the war, Marius received all the credit for his lieutenant's actions. There was nothing really improper or unprecedented about this, but it did stick in the craw of the young officer, who Marius failed often to even mention as he described how he won the war. The incident would mark the beginning of a rift between Marius and the young officer, a man named Lucius Cornelius Sulla. That rift would soon open up into a chasm, and the two men would stand for years on opposite sides of a bitter and often bloody conflict that presaged the full-blown civil wars of the following generation. But while Sulla's star was still on the rise, Marius was burning at its absolute brightest. Next week, he will check off baby eagles 2 through 6 and break every prohibition in the book doing it, serving as consul an unprecedented 5 consecutive years. In that time, he would fundamentally reshape the organization and composition of the legions, turning them from a part-time army into a fully professional fighting force. All the drilling and conditioning Marius put his armies through was essential as, to the north, an old menace was rising again. Suddenly, the complacent Romans, who had spent the better part of a century fighting wars of choice and conquering the Mediterranean with ease, suddenly found themselves facing a war of extinction. The Gallic nightmare, long dormant, was back with a vengeance, and it would take everything the Romans had just to hold them at bay, let alone conquer anything. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 31b, Marius. Last week, We cover the life of Gaius Marius through his first consulship. Up to this point, his career was impressive but hardly unique. Yes, he was a new man and deserves extra credit for forging his way upward despite the institutional barriers he faced, but he was hardly the first novus homo to be elected consul, and hardly the first Roman general to win the support of the Roman people by bringing an unpopular foreign war to an end. But Marius's ambition, and more importantly, his willingness to act on that ambition, definitely set him apart from his colleagues. There is a reason Gaius Marius deserves multi-episode treatment, and by the end of today, those reasons should be abundantly clear. In 109 BC, the consul Metellus had been sent to Africa and took Marius along with him. But in that same year, Metellus's consular colleague, Marcus Silanus, was sent north to deal with the Cimbri, a Gallic army that had been growing in strength in the north. Silanus was supposed to put down the impertinent barbarians and restore Roman order, but instead was utterly defeated. Emboldened by the Cimbri success, another Gallic tribe began making waves in 107 BC, the year of Marius's first consulship. Again, the Roman legions were sent north to put down the marauding army, but again, the legions were beaten. This time, the Roman officers left standing were only able to save their defeated troops by having them pass under the yoke, a humiliating ritual for the proud Romans. At this point, the most pressing matter was the war in North Africa, but it was fast becoming apparent that Rome faced a very real threat in the resurgent Gauls. In 106 BC, the Romans met with some success as their consul for the year, Quintus Capio, pacified a rebellious town and reintroduced some semblance of Roman superiority. But he was to give it all away the next year, leading to the circumstances that allowed Marius's unprecedented run of consulships to commence. In 105, Capio was made proconsul in Gaul, and the new consul for the year, Gnaeus Mallius, was sent north with an army to join him. Mallius, like Marius, was a new man, and the noble Capio had little interest in serving with, let alone serving beneath, the new consul. The Cimbri were on the move again, and had been joined by another of the migrating Germanic tribes, the Teutones, on the east side of the Rhone River. Mallius crossed over with his army, but when he engaged the tribes, Capio refused to come to his aid. Only after special pleading from the Senate did Capio agree to help the consular army. Even then, he refused to join his forces with Mallius's troops. As a result, the Cimbri and Teutone turned first on Capio's smaller force and drove him off, and then they swung back on Mallius, who was pushed back to the banks of the river. With nowhere to run and no reinforcements to speak of, the Romans were crushed, with casualties running upwards of 80,000. The entire debacle was chalked up in the Roman press as another example of the haughty oligarchs disrespecting anyone who did not come from their close caste. Capio would not have left a patrician cousin out in the cold like that. It was only because Mallius was novus homo that so many good Roman sons and husbands were dead on the banks of the Rhone. The popularity of the patricians was at an all-time low. So in 105 BC, the people turned back to another novus homo, a man who had proven his ability to succeed where the supposed elites had endlessly failed, Gaius Marius. The election itself was illegal, of course. There were at least 2 and possibly 3 different laws placing various restrictions on when a man could be consul, how many years must pass before he holds office again, and possibly whether holding office a second time was ever permissible. But the laws were flouted, and the rule of law gave way to popular sentiment. Marius was stationed in Africa at the time of his election, and returned to take up a mantle he had just set down 2 years before. Upon his return, he celebrated a triumph for his victory in Africa with the chain Jugurtha at the head of his procession. The spectacle climaxed with the execution of the rebellious African prince. No bribe would save him this time. Marius's first order of business was to whip the legions into shape. The army sent north had been sloppy and undisciplined, and Marius had no intention of repeating the mistakes of his predecessors. He again raised a levy without regard for property qualifications, but then took things one step further by reorganizing the basic structure of the army to meet his own specifications. It was this extra step that really secured Marius's place in history. because in doing so, he would completely abandon the maniple system and the traditional three lines that had served the army so well over the past 200 years in favor of a more robust and more mobile legion. The armies of Caesar, Pompey, and Octavius were all structured according to the Marian vision. The first thing Marius did was abolish the maniple as the basic tactical unit. Too often, the checkerboard maniples had proved insufficient against a direct frontal assault. Plus, when not facing a lockdown phalanx, it was easy for a single maniple to be surrounded and cut off from the rest of the legions. So Marius took what had once been merely an administrative classification for three maniples, the cohort, and made it the basic tactical unit. Now, rather than 160 men marching off together, the tactical box was made 400 to 500 men strong. While enlarging his tactical forces, Marius also made a decision to abandon the traditional three-line formation. It really speaks volumes of Marius's self-assuredness that he would so casually shrug off an organizational structure that had conquered most of the known world. Some would call it outright arrogance, but all his alterations were made with an eye on the coming battle with the Gauls, a campaign that would involve a lot of headlong charges from a numerically superior force. There was no sense letting the drama of having the inexperienced first line push back only to have the waiting in the wings veteran step in to save the day. He eliminated the division of age and mixed old and young into his new cohorts. He then arrayed them in three lines, a nod to the past, but drilled his troops on rapidly cycling forward, not waiting for one to be pushed back before the other stepped up. The idea was to always keep the freshest troops on the front line, have them fight like mad for a few minutes, and then go to the back and let another line step in. Hockey coaches the world over are all heirs to the Marian legacy. But Marius did not stop just with how his army fought. He also changed the entire outlook of what it meant to be a soldier. Previous armies took seriously the responsibility of combat, but left the actual packing of equipment around the world to slaves and pack animals. The baggage trains had become unwieldy, and the number of camp followers had grown to ridiculous proportions. With poor men serving year-round at his disposal, Marius simply ordered that the troops themselves carry their own equipment. It's not like they were going to argue and go home to their farms if they didn't like it. He force-marched them around Italy with 70-pound packs until they gained the strength and stamina to move quickly without worrying about a miles-long donkey train. The nobility derisively referred to the soldiers as Marius's mules, but by a factor of 10, the marching and drilling with oversized packs left Marius's legions in the best shape of any Roman army in history. In sheer stamina, they could not be matched, and when it came time to fight, they could simply outlast an enemy who put all their energy into an initial charge. Finally, Marius rebranded the army as a career choice, not just a temporary obligation for men with better things to do. He made statutory land grants to men who served their full 20 years of service and regulated dispensations of food, clothing, armor, and weapons. Marius also began to actively promote from within, taking the best of his foot soldiers and making them officers when they displayed courage and initiative. These commissions, of course, came at the expense of the young nobles, who had long been accustomed to simply stepping into positions of leadership without any real battlefield experience. The move at once made the army better, made the men love Marius, and hacked off the old patrician order. But the hurt feelings of the nobility was of no consequence to Marius, and he was single-minded in his pursuit of recapturing the glory of the old Roman legions. They had been the best for years, but were dangerously close to letting it slip away out of complacent laziness of the patrician elites. The Gallic armies waiting in the north would not simply lay down their arms because some 10th generation Claudii led the army, and to Marius, that was all that mattered. The Cimbri and Teutoni, of course, made all of these reforms possible by simply cooling off their offensive for a few years. The Cimbri had decided to try their luck in Spain, while the Teutones laid low in southern Gaul for a few years. Marius was returned for a third consulship in 103 BC to continue his reform efforts of the legions, and when that term expired, he sought office again, not wanting all of his efforts at reshaping the legions to be wasted by some new consul who did not understand what Marius was trying to accomplish. Plus, he had been preparing for a great showdown with the Gauls, and frankly, they were not playing their part very well. Marius had put a lot of effort into building an army that could defeat them, and now he wanted the credit and glory he felt he deserved. In 102 BC, in the midst of his fourth consulship, and third in a row, the barbarian tribes finally obliged and set about planning invasion of Italy. Though the Cimbrian Teutones combined to form an army a staggering 200,000 men strong, they made a critical error and decided that instead of overwhelming the Romans in a single mass onslaught, they would divide and invade Italy on two fronts. It may have looked good on paper, but it let the outnumbered Romans off a rather large hook. With the barbarian army divided, Marius could focus on one, then the other, without ever facing the insurmountable odds that an army of 200,000 men presented. The Cimbri circled around and were set to come into Italy through the Alps from the northeast, while the Teutoni were to come in along the Mediterranean coast. Marius sent a force under his consular colleague's direction to delay the Cimbri's passage through the Alps, while Marius himself took his new toy into France to head off the Teutones before they ever got to the mountains. Further tribal recklessness led to another piece of good luck for Marius. A contingent of 300,000 Germans broke out ahead of the main barbarian army as soon as they caught sight of the Romans. Marius was able to rout this charge with ease and place half a legion behind some nearby hills before withdrawing. The rest of the Teutonic army marched forward in pursuit, and when they had passed the hidden cohorts, Marius turned and attacked. All their attention forward, the barbarians never saw the 3,000 Romans emerge from their hiding place. Unsure of who or what was attacking them from behind, the barbarian army became a mass of confusion, which Marius easily exploited. The Teutonic army was annihilated. Things did not go smoothly against the Cimbri, however. The other consul for the year had been unable to hold them back, and by the end of 102 BC, Italy found itself playing the unwilling host to 100,000 barbarian invaders. In the elections that year, Marius was again returned as consul. No sense in getting off the horse in midstream. In the summer of 101, Marius led the horse safely to the other side of the river, meeting and defeating the much larger barbarian army. All the drilling and marching proved the difference against the far larger but far less disciplined hordes. Marius returned to Rome and celebrated his second triumph. At this point, only Scipio Africanus loomed larger in the Roman imagination than the great Gaius Marius, who was now the hero of two separate wars against two completely different enemies. Sure, there was grumbling in the upper classes about this commoner who seemed to be making himself king, but the danger was as real for them as it was for the lower classes, and Marius proved himself more than up to the tasks for which he had been assigned. So they held their noses and cheered along with everyone else. Out of gratitude for his success, Marius was made consul for the fifth time in a row in 100 BC. It may have been one consulship too many, however, as a bit of Marius's popular luster wore off. Grain prices were on the rise again, and tribunes, taking a cue from the Gracchi, were agitating for relief. Unrest began to ripple through the city, and the Senate ordered Marius to do something about it. Seeing the immediate expediency of restoring order to Rome, Marius complied, but it pitted him against the popular assemblies who had done so much to lend credibility to his never-ending reign. At the end of the year, Marius decided that enough was enough and announced his retirement from public life. If the story had ended there, Marius would have already secured his place in history as one of Rome's greatest and most famous leaders. But he was not done yet. Next week, the old man will be pulled out of retirement to deal with the inevitable result of Roman mistreatment of their Italian allies. In what would become known as the Social War, Marius would again fight alongside Sulla, his perennial lieutenant, now a general in his own right. The Social War would be the last time the two fought on the same side, and the intense rivalry between the two men would soon erupt into a bloody back and forth of purging and counter-purging that shocks the conscience even today. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 32, The Social War. After his final consulship in 100 BC, Gaius Marius returned to a self-imposed exile, and it appeared that the great general had left the public stage for good. 10 years of relative peace followed, until, in 91 BC, Rome was once again threatened by a hostile enemy, triggering Marius's return to the familiar territory of war and politics. This time, however, he would not be fighting Numidians or Gauls. Rather, he would be fighting the very men who helped him to defeat the Numidians and Gauls. Some of them, anyway. The Roman-led Italian confederacy, which had endured now for hundreds of years and had stood firm even against the clever might of Hannibal Barca, whose entire strategy hinged on bringing about its dissolution, was finally breaking apart. The second-class status afforded the Italian allies finally became intolerable, and rather than making obviously just concessions, the tone-deaf Roman Senate took a hard-line stance, initiating what was to become known as the Social War, when a collection of Italian allies would break away and form an independent state. After 2 years, the Italians would finally be granted their simple request to be treated as equals, but of course, those were a bloody 2 years. The war served no one's interests and should have never started. Just another example of unnecessary carnage brought about by short-sighted pig-headedness. Trouble had been brewing for years. The fight for full Italian citizenship had picked up momentum during the tribunates of the Gracchi, but the Senate had always managed to block the extension of suffrage, more concerned with the immediate political expediency of denying the Gracchi and their allies a victory than actually addressing whether or not the policy was right or wrong. In 91 BC, the flint was sparked again by a tribune named Marcus Drusus. This time, the kindling lit, and pretty soon a full-scale bonfire was raging. In the past, the Confederate arrangement between Rome and the allied Italian cities had served everyone well. The Italians were nominally independent, but were required to provide troops to serve in the legions if Rome required it. In return for their troop levies, the Italians had always shared generously in the spoils of war, and found their formal taxes kept to a bare minimum. But in recent decades, while their commitment increased, by the turn of the 1st century BC, fully 65% of the raised legions were composed of non-Roman Italians, war booty was increasingly held by the Roman leadership. This began to irk the Italians, but they had no official way to address the situation and had no say in the election of the consuls, who had now grown accustomed to giving their allies the shaft. Their attitude grew steadily worse after Marius eliminated the distinction between Roman and non-Roman legions. Indeed, Marius famously stated that in the din of battle he could not tell Roman and ally apart. So here they were, literally fighting side by side with the Romans, but taking home an increasingly reduced share of the profits. Many assumed after Marius's reform that citizenship would soon follow, leaving them bitterly disappointed when the Senate refused to take up the issue. Finally, in 91, a tribune named Marcus Livius Drusus introduced legislation aimed at providing full equality to the Italians. Oddly enough, Drusus was no radical populare. Indeed, his legislation was aimed at diminishing the ability of rabble-rousing tribunes to sway the hordes of Rome against the Senate, who Drusus saw as the true defenders of republican virtue. By introducing more level-headed middle-class Italians into the electorate, Drusus hoped to shift power away from the populist demagogues who had only the narrow interests of their constituents at heart. The Senate didn't pick up on the vibe Drusus was laying down, however, and immediately opposed the idea. They were confident in their hold on power and didn't want to introduce an unstable element into the equation. Besides, they might start peeling off some of those riches the senators had been hoarding for themselves. So, oblivious to their own long-term self-interest, a cabal of patricians conspired to put a stop to Drusus. First they killed his legislation, and when that didn't seem to work, they simply killed Drusus. For the Italians watching from the sidelines, the assassination of Drusus was the final straw. They really thought that this time around, the Senate would listen and make them full equals. The dead tribune's body, however, told them everything they needed to know. The time for drastic action had arrived. One by one, Italian cities began to openly declare that they no longer bore any allegiance to Rome, and henceforth would be completely free and independent. At the vanguard of this movement were the Samnites, one of Rome's oldest foes, who had never fully gotten over their final defeat some 200 years earlier. In Rome, the news was greeted with furious disbelief. To them, the issue of who ruled Italy had been solved at the close of the Samnite Wars. But the disbelief did not delay their actions, and legions were immediately raised to put the upstarts back in their place. Across Italy, though, town after town joined with the anti-Roman Confederacy. The only region to remain steadfastly in the Roman camp were the Latins. Everyone else, it seemed, was going to take their shot at independence. It did not, however, turn out to be a very good shot. In the city of Corfinium, which lay across the Apennines due east of Rome, representatives of the various Italian cities gathered to formalize their alliance. They renamed Corfinium Italica and declared that it was the seat of a new government based on the Roman model, complete with its own senate and assemblies, but completely free of Roman rule. The immediate business of the new Italian government was the very war their existence had sparked. The Romans were not going to take this rebellion with grace and good humor, so preparations had to be made to withstand the inevitable onslaught. The Romans, quick with the rod, sent their consular armies out in opposite directions in 90 BC, one north and one south, to put the revolt down. To the north went the consul Publius Rutilius, who coaxed out of retirement his famous relative Gaius Marius to act as a military advisor. It didn't do much good, though, as Rutilius quickly led his army to a series of blundering, mistake-prone defeats. Finally, the consul made his one positive contribution to the war effort by getting himself killed. After the consul's death, Marius stepped into the leadership vacuum and quickly had the northern Italians on the run. With the situation in the north for the most part well in hand, the focus of the Romans turned south, where they faced the horrible déjà vu of crossing swords with the dreaded Samnites. Lucius Julius Caesar, the consul leading the Romans in the south, and the elder relative of a 10-year-old boy named Gaius, found the Samnites no less fierce an opponent than when last they met in battle. Caesar, along with his fellow commander Lucius Cornelius Sulla, watched in vain as the Samnites sacked a number of Roman towns. But they were finally able to halt the advance and keep the Samnites bottled up while Caesar returned to Rome to oversee the consular elections. But before he left office, Caesar laid the political foundation of the war's end. The Senate, understanding now that citizenship was inevitable, passed the Lex Julia, granting citizenship to those Italian cities who had not joined the rebellion, and offering it to any Italian currently in revolt who laid down his arms. The vast majority of Italians to whom independence had been an unwelcome state anyway jumped at the chance, but the Samnites and a collection of tribes in the north continued to hold out. In 89 BC, Sulla was given full command of the southern troops and showed himself to be a brilliant tactician and leader of men. After saving a besieged legion at the city of Nola, Sulla was awarded the grass crown by the grateful soldiers whose lives he had saved. His fame was growing, and, to the people of Rome, Sulla emerged as the clear hero of the social war. This did not sit well with Marius, who had been maneuvered out of his command in the north when the Senate, afraid of the old consul returning to the political arena, gave the north over to Capio, the son of the consul who had left Mallius out to dry during the war against the Gauls. But when Capio fell in battle, Marius was sure he was destined to return to Rome the triumphant hero. But the Senate again thwarted him and sent the consul Pompey Strabo, the father of Pompey the Great, north to take over. There was little Marius could do, and he was forced to play a subordinate role as Pompey laid a brutal siege to the town of Asculum, which was the last city in the north holding out. Once Asculum fell, the back of the resistance had been broken, and the fight went out of the Italians. By this time, most of them had already given up anyway, content with the fact that they had achieved exactly what they wanted, and would soon be full equals in a united Italy. Sulla wrapped up the last pockets of resistance in the south, and the brief social war was over. As a footnote, I should mention that during these years, a young noble named Cicero was punching the clock on his brief military career in order to qualify for the political career he really wanted, fighting both under Pompey Strabo and Sulla. Cicero had no taste at all for battle, and never made any secret that he disliked war. In later life, he was given a statue of Mars by a friend to add to his growing collection, and Cicero wrote in reply, Why send me a statue of Mars? You know I'm a pacifist. But from 90 to 88 BC, young Cicero did what he had to do and slogged around Samnium, knowing that no man in Rome could hope to lead without a few war stories to make him credible. Another young noble who cut his teeth during the social war was Gnaeus Pompeius, though his attitude towards battle was much more in keeping with the Roman tradition than the bookish Cicero. Only 17 at the time, he was called to action in 89 BC to serve with his father in the north and was presumably present during the siege of Asculum. The young Pompey, if Plutarch is to be believed, already had an air of greatness surrounding him, and his fellow troops made comparisons to young Alexander the Great and Scipio Africanus. Pompey and Cicero had little in common personally, but in 40 years, the two men, all grown up and having reached the pinnacle of the political ladder, would find themselves on the same side of a bitter civil war against a man who at the time of the social war was only 10. I often think that this was about the only time Pompey and Cicero would have proved a match for Julius Caesar, who, in his good time, would both outfight Pompey, Rome's greatest general, and outpolitic Cicero, Rome's greatest politician. But how were they supposed to know that? By the time Sulla remarked that in the teenage Caesar he saw many a Marius, it was probably too late. Remember, though, that sometimes the best way to win is to make sure that your opponent is still a child. The social war was paradoxically both a war of unification and the last time for 70 years the Romans themselves were truly unified. In 88 BC, just as the Italian allies were being officially enrolled as full Roman citizens, Sulla was elected to his first consulship. In itself, it seemed a natural and innocuous choice. He was, after all, the hero of the most recent war, so who better to lead Rome? Besides, in the east, Mithridates, the king of Pontus, was hatching the first of his seemingly endless merry-go-rounds with the Roman legions. Who better, then, to march out and face this new threat in the east than the great Sulla? Well, according to the aging Marius, he was. And the old general became convinced that it was his destiny to lead the legions in the east. Unfortunately, he couldn't convince anyone else to back him, and why should they? Sure, he had been great in his prime, but it was a different age, and it was becoming clear that Marius was borderline senile and clearly unable to wrap his head around the fact that the world was moving on without him. Sulla was young, dynamic, and clearly represented the future of Rome, so he was unanimously chosen to head up the armies headed east. Marius, bitter in defeat, decided that rather than go out quietly, he would order his hardcore partisans to do everything in their power to reverse the decision and place Marius himself back in charge. Sulla was forced to flee the city and made his way to the encamped legions, most of whom were loyal veterans of the social war. But though he briefly held on to power, Marius's desperate, selfish grab triggered a wholly unprecedented response from Sulla, who did not take his eviction well. Pretty soon, word reached Marius and his partisans that the aggrieved consul was on his way back, at the head of a full consular army. Sulla, it seemed, was marching on Rome. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 33, Marius Sulla. After emerging as the hero of the social war, Lucius Cornelius Sulla had been elected consul in 88 BC. With the brief civil war put to rest, Roman attention was immediately diverted east, where Mithridates IV, king of Pontus, was threatening the newly incorporated province of Asia, located on the far side of the Aegean. Trouble had been brewing for years, and in 88 BC, Mithridates did not simply cross the line, he jumped over it. After several run-ins with the Roman legions garrisoned in the east, Mithridates decided that the Westerners had to go, and Anatolia should be returned to her native people. To this end, he initiated a mass slaughter that was to become known as the Asiatic Vespers. Enlisting the help of locals in cities across the Turkish peninsula, anyone who so much as spoke with a Latin accent was targeted for death. Over 80,000 Roman citizens and allies were murdered across the east, coinciding with the king's invasion of Asia. The Romans were justifiably horrified and immediately raised an invasion force to avenge the slaughter. Sulla was the natural choice to lead the invasion, but old Marius had his mind set on one last fling with glory, and arranged for the Senate's choice of Sulla to lead to be annulled by the people's assemblies. This annulment was guaranteed when armed gladiatorial bodyguards in the employ of Marius and his allies literally threw senators out of the Senate so a quorum could not be reached to overturn the decision, to overturn the original decision the Senate had come to originally. The introduction of mob violence into Roman politics precipitated by the Gracchi was starting to become less and less an exception, and more the rule. Sulla was forced to flee for his life and made his way to the army encamped along the Adriatic. The army was ready for the planned invasion, but before they sailed east, Sulla would march them west. He incited the troops, most of whom were loyal to Sulla anyway, into a frenzy over the anti-democratic thuggery of Marius. Ready to follow Sulla anywhere, the consul pointed them towards Rome and announced that with their help, he was going to evict Marius from the city. His officers were appalled. It was illegal for the legions to cross the traditional city limits of Rome, and as much as they disapproved of Marius, they simply could not abide by Sulla's brazen flouting of the law. When they reached the city, all but one of Sulla's officers, a close lieutenant named Lucullus, refused to cross the line. Sulla respected their decision, but was not dissuaded from his plan, and took the troops right into Rome. Inside the city, Marian partisans organized gladiators and slaves into a defense force, but they were no match for trained legionnaires, and in the brief street fighting that ensued, Sulla's army had no trouble turning the pathetic defenders to heel. Marius himself barely escaped with his life and fled, along with his son, to Africa. Sulla restored order to Rome, had Marius declared an enemy of the state, and put the Senate back in control of the city. All of this drama filled the entirety of Sulla's year as consul, and it wasn't until 87 BC that he was actually able to lead his army out of the city to the east, where they should have already commenced the retaliatory campaign against Mithridates. But the minute Sulla left town, Marius began to plot his return. Many in Rome, who had been ambivalent in the political showdown between Marius and Sulla, had been pushed over to the Marian camp by Sulla's completely illegal and immoral seizure of the city. In 87 BC, the people of Rome did themselves no favors if they hoped to keep turmoil in the city to a minimum by electing as co-consuls Gnaeus Octavius, a staunch conservative and Sulla partisan, and Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a populare who was fast becoming the leader of the anti-Sulla forces in Rome. While not necessarily pro-Marius, Cinna nonetheless saw an alliance with the old general as an advantageous way to box out Sulla's allies. Throughout 87 BC, Octavius and Cinna clashed repeatedly, until Cinna was driven out of town by an angry mob. Once outside Rome, Cinna immediately began gathering men who were to help him fight his way back to power. Marius, meanwhile, was raising an army in Africa with the intention of following the precedent Sulla had just set by marching on Rome and capturing the city. When Marius crossed the short span of the Mediterranean back into Italy at the head of a loyal army, Cinna saw an opportunity to strengthen his own position. He formally joined with Marius, and the combined forces stormed into Rome. What followed was 5 straight days of terror and bloodshed. Marius simply released his army inside the city, with orders to kill anyone allied with, or suspected of allying with, or suspected as having the same name as someone who was allied with Sulla. Noble families fled or fought depending on their disposition. Captured Sulla partisans were killed, and their heads were displayed in the forum. Finally, after 5 days of unchecked violence, Cinna could stand no more and ordered his own troops to put a stop to Marius's men. The army from Africa was ordered to stand down, and those who refused were killed by Cinna's troops. Order finally restored, elections for next year's consulships were held. That Marius and Cinna were elected came as no surprise to anyone. Everyone who opposed them was either dead or fled. For Marius, the election to his 7th consulship fulfilled the promise of his legendary encounter with the 7 eagle chicks so many years before. Satisfied that his destiny had been met, the old general died in 86 BC, just 2 weeks after his election, leaving Cinna in sole control of Rome. While all this drama was unfolding back home, Sulla was off in the east leading the effort to repacify Greece. Mithridates had overrun the province of Asia and had made the Greek cities along the Aegean coast his accomplices in the mass murder of Latins in Anatolia. Welcomed as a liberator, the king pressed his luck by going one step further and attempted to push the Romans out of Greece altogether. In his effort, he was backed by the Armenian kingdom, which was reaching the zenith of its own power. Combined, the two hoped to retake the eastern Mediterranean from the alien Westerners. The ensuing war with Rome would have far-reaching consequences. Rather than being pushed back to where they came from, the Romans wound up planting their standards even further from home. When Sulla crossed over to Epirus in 87 BC, he found that Mithridates was well on his way to turning the Greeks against Rome. In Athens, a puppet tyrant had been installed and was backed by a Pontic army, led by Mithridates' most able general, Archelaus. This would be as far west as Mithridates would make it, however, as the mere sight of the 40,000 Roman soldiers was enough to convince the remaining Greek cities to remain loyal. Sulla's first order of business was to bring Athens back into the Roman fold. When he arrived, though, the city was obstinate and shut its gates, so Sulla was forced to sit back and lay a siege. While encamped outside the city, refugees from the Marian Reign of Terror began to trickle in, and Sulla first received the news that Marius had returned to power, and that he had been officially exiled from Rome. He maintained his focus on the task at hand, however, and for the rest of the year and through the beginning of 86 BC, Sulla remained at the gates of Athens. Finally, in March of 86, the vigilance of the Athenian defenders waned, and Sulla stormed the walls in a midnight raid. Once inside, Sulla was not feeling particularly generous and did nothing to rein his troops in. The slaughter was only halted after Greek friends of Sulla begged him to stop the carnage. The Pontic army under Archelaus had sailed north, and Sulla left Athens to lick its many wounds. On his way out the door, however, Sulla set fire to the Athenian port of Piraeus, a final reminder of what happens to those who stand against Rome. Sulla caught up with Archelaus north of Athens in the Greek province of Boeotia. The Pontic army by this point numbered 120,000, 3 times larger than the Roman legions chasing them. Sulla studiously avoided being drawn into a fight until he found terrain that would mitigate Archelaus' overwhelming numerical advantage. Finally, at Chaeronea, Sulla found his spot. He lured Archelaus into attacking when the Romans held fortified high ground. With Sulla personally dashing from wing to wing to keep up with wave after wave sent in by Archelaus, the Romans outlasted the increasingly stretched-thin Pontic army. Seeing a shot, Sulla charged and chased the opposing army back towards their camp, encircling them before they reached home base. The final casualty figures showed that while the Pontic army had been slaughtered, the Romans emerged from the battle practically unscathed. With this smashing victory in Greece, Sulla remained as popular as ever with the people of Rome, despite the continuing hostility from the elites left in the city, and the fact that he technically was in exile. Cinna was re-elected consul in 85 BC, and decided that Sulla needed to be formally relieved of duty, not because there was any doubt he would triumph over Mithridates, but because there was no doubt he would eventually triumph over Mithridates, and that victory would leave Sulla, unquestionably, the most powerful man in Rome. So Cinna raised an army and placed men with strong anti-Sulla passions in charge. They were to find Sulla, relieve him of his command, and combine the two armies. However, when the army led by Lucius Valerius Flaccus and Gaius Flavius Fimbria arrived and camped beside Sulla's army, things went backward. Sulla encouraged the new arrivals to defect over to his side, and pretty soon, the new army was hemorrhaging troops. Flaccus, unable to make Sulla stand down, led his army north, officially to track down the army Mithridates himself was leading towards Greece, but unofficially to simply distance himself from the seductive charisma of Sulla. The dissension in the ranks spread, however, and the remaining troops soured on Flaccus. Eventually, his second-in-command Fimbria led a mutiny. Flaccus was murdered and Fimbria took over. But being a staunch Marian partisan, the new leader had no intention of joining with Sulla. He just wanted to take Mithridates himself and steal Sulla's thunder. Sulla himself remained behind in Boeotia, readying himself for the rematch with Archelaus, who was being reinforced from the east by the Armenians, and soon was back at the head of an army again numbering more than 100,000. The two sides met at Orchomenos, but the outcome was no different this time around. The superior tactical ability of Sulla, which was executed by the far more disciplined Roman soldiers, was too much for the Pontic army. Once again, Archelaus was forced to make a run for it as Sulla annihilated the army he left behind. After crossing the Hellespont into Asia, Fimbria found Mithridates and fought a limited battle that saw Rome get the better of the Pontic king. But without support from the Roman navy patrolling the Aegean, Mithridates was able to slip away from Fimbria. The navy, led by Lucullus, Sulla's most loyal officer, was not about to come to the aid of a political enemy. Mithridates, however, could see the handwriting on the wall, and in late 85 BC, he offered to come to terms with the Romans. The Pontic king met with Sulla, much to Fimbria's dismay, and peace terms were hashed out. Mithridates was to remain in control of Pontus, but had to otherwise withdraw his forces from every other region he occupied. Rome would move in and occupy these territories, extending Roman dominion even further into the east. The territories that had rebelled and the newly acquired regions were forced to pay a steep price for challenging Rome. Not only was the annual tax burden increased, but Sulla demanded 5 years' worth of back taxes at the same rate. The financial punishment left most of Anatolia deep in debt and unable to direct their wealth towards any other end than paying back Rome. This, in addition to filling Rome's coffers, kept them from making further mischief. With the war against Mithridates settled, Sulla returned to his war against his domestic political opponents. Fimbria, who had taken command of the province of Asia, was of immediate concern. The mutinous general talked a good game, but the minute Sulla crossed the Hellespont, Fimbria committed suicide, knowing he was no match for Sulla and would likely be executed one way or the other for his actions. With the east fully pacified, Sulla began to strategize about a return to Rome. Cinna, who had effectively run the city for the past few years unopposed, was well aware that if Sulla came back, the party would come to an abrupt end. Taking advantage of some minor commotion in Illyria, Cinna raised an army to quell the unrest. The fact that Illyria lay directly between Sulla and Rome had nothing to do with Cinna's desire to march an army there, of course. In his haste, bordering on panic, to get his army in place, Cinna, however, pushed his troops too hard, force marching them through snowdrifts to reach Illyria in time to block Sulla's path. In one of history's little twists of fate, Cinna's soldiers mutinied and stoned the four-time consul to death. The path to Rome now lay open, and hearing the news, Sulla immediately ordered his troops to head home. Sulla, it seemed, was marching on Rome. Again. There will be no episode next week, as I will be spending the weekend moving across town, but in 2 weeks, we'll return for Sulla's second march on Rome, the crowning of Rome's first dictator for life, and, inexplicably, the retirement of Rome's first dictator for life.